My name is Dan O'Brien. I'm the Deputy Director of the Grants Office for the City of Philadelphia, specializing in grants implementation. And I'm formerly specialized in community development and community outreach, both in Philadelphia and overseas with the Peace Corps. I think there wasn't a single moment where it all came down to me about the importance of trauma. It happened in a couple stages. The initial time that trauma was put on my radar was when I was working overseas. I was working with Operation Smile over in Jordan, and they were working with a series of four different missions of Iraqi patients who had to have the operation over in Jordan. And it was week-long missions. So working with those families, this is 2006, 2007, things were pretty hectic in Iraq, that's why they had to have the operations over in Jordan. So I got to spend a lot of time with families coming from Sadr City, from Basra, from Mosul, who had all dealt with certain traumatic events in the very recent past, within the last couple of years. Some were missing limbs, most had lost relatives. And they were come flying over to Jordan to spend a week where one of their children was getting a serious operation. And we'd spend time at nights, and a lot of emotions would come up, and they'd talk about things. And that's when, you'd have a conversation for 30 seconds and somebody would break down in tears, talking about the loss of a loved one, or how scared they were for their child who was having an operation or just had an operation there. So that's when I became cognizant of the power of trauma. But that was really easy to wrap your head around. It's really easy to wrap your head around trauma as it relates to a bombing or a terrorist attack. Everybody can relate to that. I think when I became aware of the depth and breadth of trauma as an issue across the world is when I came home to Philadelphia and was working in refugee resettlement and worked with people from Bhutan, from Burma, from Sudan, from Eritrea, who had all come over to the United States as refugees and had all experienced different types of trauma. And were now trying to start their life anew with not a ton of resources and also trying to deal with their past, what had happened to them. And I found out that the Burmese refugees, their trigger was police officers because of what happened in their country. In Eritrea, the trigger was more military, although the police officers could be lumped into that from their point of view. In Bhutan, the refugees' trigger was paperwork, government paperwork, because 30 years ago a census had been used against their minority group to figure out that they had now become, this ethnic Nepali group in Bhutan had become 20% of the country, and they were all rounded up and just shipped out, and they've lived in refugee camps for the last 30 years. So we had to come back and prep all these Bhutanese refugees to let them know that the 2010 census is coming, and don't worry, this isn't going to happen again. This happens every 10 years. And it was just interesting to see that trauma doesn't necessarily have to be the death of a loved one. It could be systematic degradation of your group, of your family. And so I think that's when it all came to me and gave me the big picture. To get real personal, I think it's helped me to be a better father. Just learning about trauma and the science behind it. I've been very aware of how to talk to my kids and how not to talk to my kids, and what could negatively affect them that I never would have thought about before, but makes total sense. In a larger role for my work, I think just because of my experience, I've always been erred more on the side of being empathetic. But being able to recognize trauma a little more quickly. And not only recognize it, but I'm certainly not curing any trauma, but just to be able to work with it, to not exacerbate it. I think it's helped immensely, especially working in communities where there's high gun violence. There's going to be trauma in some form every day that hasn't been treated necessarily. And being able to recognize that quickly, and also being able to not be offended if somebody uses either their fight or flight option and gets upset when I didn't expect it to happen, I don't take it personally. And a lot of time it can be traced back to a specific traumatic event. I think I was most interested in getting involved and most excited about the Sanctuary Project in Strawberry Mansion because I had worked in the community for 4 or 5 years beforehand. Made a lot of friends in the community and attended hundreds of community meetings and events, and I knew that there was trauma, and I knew it wasn't being dealt with, and I knew that was the undercurrent of a lot of problems in the community. And this was a direct answer, and I'll give you an example of the trauma that was happening in that community. We were working in Strawberry Mansion. It was Saturday in June, handing out flyers for a community meeting that was coming up in the following weeks. And this was a community day. There was a cookout, and we left, and shortly after we left, there was a shooting. And it wasn't just a targeted shooting. It was, they sprayed this block. They were trying to target somebody, but the bullets were everywhere. People hit the deck. Now, if that happened to you or I, we'd probably never go to that block again. 10 minutes later, the party was going on again because nobody was hit. And that's, there's a shell has developed and a normalization has developed around gun violence. And there's a lot of, that's a normal reaction if you see that on a regular basis to protect yourself, is you have to normalize it. You can't freak out every time. So seeing that was just a manifestation, like it was an obvious example of trauma in the community, and that community-wide trauma, not just a single person or a single family. So hearing that the sanctuary model was going to come to Strawberry Mansion, was going to work with the community and work with the residents, it was obvious the impact that could have. The changes that I've helped facilitate in my system is I always say that nothing is happening because of me directly, but because I've worked in the community and I've worked downtown a lot, often simultaneously, I have a unique access to both worlds. I've seen a lot of great conversations around trauma happening in classrooms and in boardrooms, whether they be city or private organizations. And I've seen a lot of great conversations around trauma happening at community meetings and at schools. And I found oftentimes there's a disconnect between the two groups. So if my role can be to just get people talking to each other from those two worlds and connecting, that's where I think I can provide the most value. And that's where I have so far, I hope. The advice I would give to other cities when maybe if they're deciding how to train people or how to inform themselves on trauma would be to get as many employees, citizens, whomever of your town exposed to this information. Whether it's a formal multi-day training, whether it's a packet, every page of information that I've read has helped me in some way, whether personally or in my work life. And that's not just because I work in community development. In any job, being able to work with people and recognize pain and how to deal with it, how to deal with your own, trauma, because, trauma is relative. The worst thing that's ever happened to me could be a walk in the park for somebody else, but it's still, for me, it was traumatic. So everybody's got a different gauge and everybody has a different experience. And knowing how to recognize that and knowing how to deal with all those, both internally and externally, has been a huge help. And from a city or a town's point of view, getting your employees like librarians, like rec center employees, school employees, getting them trained in trauma-informed care in the sanctuary model, I can't tell you the benefit that it'll be. It's completely impactful and it's immediate. I think our city has done a great job of becoming cognizant of trauma-informed care on a higher level and accepting of it and positive. There's a great feeling around trauma-informed care. People appreciate it, and people recognize its value. Now, having that spread out across the city to different departments, to different organizations, that's where the work has to be done right now. People are bought in at the high level, and now we need to get the greater part of the city involved. And like I said, that includes the libraries, the schools, the rec centers, the pre-Ks. Anything that's dealing with youth, anything that's dealing with any citizen in neighborhoods across the city that might be dealing with trauma, which is pretty much everywhere. I think we need to start dealing with trauma before it happens instead of reacting to traumatic events. 15 years from now, I see if all our missions are accomplished and we are a trauma-informed city, I see city employees, when they're hired, part of the onboarding process is training the sanctuary model and trauma-informed care. And in every department around the city that is outward-facing, and that could be L&I, that could be the streets department, people are aware of trauma-informed care and are working with it on a daily basis. In the current mayor's new vision for a pre-K everywhere, I want all of those pre-Ks to be trauma-informed. I think that's not only dealing with the kids, dealing with the families. Every school, currently, unfortunately, every school doesn't even have a guidance counselor. I'd like every school to have a trauma-informed staff, whether directly just for trauma or just everyone is trained in it and can deal with situations. And again, a lot of times people think about trauma as a specific violent event, and that's not necessarily the case. Poverty is traumatizing. So people need to recognize, I think school workers and people who deal with kids have to deal with, they recognize that if something specific hasn't happened to a child, that doesn't necessarily mean they're not being traumatized. Every city employee, every outward-facing organization, having them trauma-informed and having that be part of the HR department everywhere, making that is just a requirement, along with ethics. Every city employee has to go through ethics training, which is fine, and that's fantastic. Every city employee should have to go through trauma-informed training as well. I would say yes. I've seen a very positive impact, but when dealing in trauma, in dealing in something that people have sometimes kept inside for decades, where maybe there's been trauma over generations, you can't expect a mission accomplished banner to be hung in a year or 18 months or 2 years or 5 years. This is incremental work, and oftentimes it's tough to prove what didn't happen. So if somebody doesn't blow up at the library because something didn't go their way, we'll never know that, But I know that the community members who have participated in the sanctuary training are better off for it. And the more we can spread that out, the better the city's going to be.